and you are not welcome here.
Lords of the Fallen is the next big Souls-like, and with that title comes a lot to live up to. Now, I've just clocked in my first playthrough at about 45 hours, and man do I have a lot to say about this game, because we've entered in a new era of Souls-like games, where now they're actually good, and not just good, but standing toe-to-toe with the masterpieces that From Software created for decades, and that's an era I am more than happy to step into. And although I will be comparing this game to many of From Software's catalog, do not mistake how much of its own identity Lords of the Fallen has. This review will be spoiler free, although I will be using out of context footage of the majority of the game simply to paint a picture of what it has to offer, but unless you've played it, it's not going to make any sense to you. And this is a review and not a guide, since we've already made a beginner's guide for this game. So with all that being said, let me tell you about Lords of the Fallen. A lot of you may recognize the name Lords of the Fallen from the original game back in 2014, and it is a bit of a shame that they share the same title, because while back then it was very poorly received, the new Lords of the Fallen is an entire reboot and shares almost nothing with its predecessor. This is made under a new development team at CI Games and Hexworks, and you don't need to know a thing in order to dive into this one. The story of Lords of the Fallen centers around a war between the followers of Aureus working to prevent the return of the demon god Adir. Several beacons were constructed around Mornstead to contain his power, guarded by the hallowed sentinels. However, now the beacons have become corrupted, and it's your job as the Dark Crusader to walk in the world between good and evil, wielding the heretical power of Umbral to cleanse the beacons and seal off Adir once and for all, but only if you so choose. And so you'll spend much of your game traversing two worlds. The world of the living Axiom and the world of the dead Umbral, using your Umbral lamp to solve puzzles, traverse unseen areas, or manipulate the souls of your enemies. And this is where the game really sets itself apart from the competition, because the developers have done a fantastic job in incorporating a world that uses all these elements simultaneously and flows between realities seamlessly, so that Umbral and the lamp aren't just gimmicks, but foundational to the game in a way that can't be ignored. And I can say with full confidence, this never became annoying a single time. Every encounter in Umbral felt handcrafted, and there was always something else to explore on the other side of an already engaging level design. And occasionally there would be entire levels hidden behind paths that only exist in Umbral. But it wasn't as if you had to keep your lamp up at all times. Because the levels are crafted well, you could generally deduce when there was going to be an Umbral puzzle. And if you are someone that wants to be looking through Umbral at all times, you have dangers of your own to worry about, because enemies that are found in Umbral can rip you into their dimension. Overall, I thought the dual world system was done perfectly, and was such an interesting twist on the genre, adding an extra layer to the exploration and the world as a whole. It's honestly going to be hard to go back to a Souls-like that doesn't have this. But now let's talk about arguably the most important part of any Souls-like, the combat. Because a lot of people have had a lot to say about Lords of the Fallen's combat, and honestly a lot of people have been wrong. Because there's a lot of takes out there calling the combat clunky, when in reality that's just simply not the case. And this is where I'm going to throw in some comparisons. I really can't stress enough how different it is to watch this game versus play it. Because while it might look slow on the other side of the screen, when you're actually hands-on, the game is so responsive that in your moment-to-moment combat it feels like something in between Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Your character moves fast, there's good iframes on the dodges, and the hitboxes are visually accurate. In my opinion, the combat was great, and a ton of fun to play. At no point did I feel like I wasn't in full control of my character, and enemies always reacted to getting hit by my weapons. And it's because of that sharp responsiveness that I found the combat to be addicting. My attacks felt like they had weight behind them, and would stagger about 90% of the enemies with one hit. If we compare the combat directly to Dark Souls 3, we can see it's just barely a bit more rigid, but the weapon impact and dodge timings are almost exact, and this is mainly due to a lack of downtime. Like I was mentioning with responsiveness, you are always in control, so it feels very good to play. And I think a lot of this comes from the sprint animation looking a bit wonky, but again, it's a matter of watching versus playing, and I never found it to actually bother me. The only issue I have with the combat is the animation for getting knocked down as the player. This one is clunky, and it feels so out of place in the rest of the combat that's so fast and responsive That one animation feels like it's from an entirely different game. Thankfully though, the amount of attacks that actually knock the player down are very few and far between. It only happened a handful of times throughout my whole playthrough. I have to give credit to the developers too for making the combat so balanced. You have a lot of tools at your disposal, mainly the parry and the dodge, and thankfully they're both equally viable. At no point does the game force you to use one over the other, and while parrying is a bit more of a risk than dodging, you have a higher reward in the visceral attacks, and the amount of stagger buildup that it does to the enemy. Now I decided to make a greatsword build, and the size of your weapon does affect your parry window, with smaller weapons having more of a chance to parry, and I was perfectly fine dodging for the rest of my playthrough. So overall, I really enjoyed the combat in this game. Again, it looks a little funny on the other side of the screen, but once you play it, I bet you'll feel the same. But now let's switch gears and talk about the second most important thing in a Souls-like, the boss fights. And these were absolutely the highlight of the game. All of the mainline bosses nailed spectacle, balance, fun, and challenge. And I was blown away at just how creative they were. Every boss was more than just a straightforward fight, with unique elements that made them special among the rest. Whether it was having to use the arena to gain an advantage, or peering into Umbral to find a hidden puzzle, none of it ever felt like a gimmick. And they didn't use the same trick twice, so the boss fights incorporated my brain in ways that felt engaging and fresh. So even if a boss was just a beefed up version of a normal enemy, it still had its own twist. And since the combat is just fun, they never became frustrating or overstayed their welcome. And to add to that, none of the bosses felt like a brick wall. Each time I encountered one, they were adequately balanced to the level I would have reached them, which in turn made it much more fun than frustrating. They weren't so fast that the player couldn't handle them, they didn't use cheap tricks like feinting attacks, and no combo went longer than 4 hits tops. These are good, genuine Souls-like bosses, and honestly were a breath of fresh air. And my main complaint was that I could only fight them once. I just wish there were more. Now, I haven't found all the secret bosses yet, but at least for the mainline ones, I thoroughly enjoyed fighting every single one. Now, I definitely wouldn't say any of them were easy, but I do think a few of them could be buffed up, because I managed to beat every fight within 3 to 8 attempts. And on paper, that's exactly where you want it to be, at least for solo play, but since I played the whole game without summoning, I am a bit worried co-op is going to be a cakewalk. And that's what I've heard from people that did play multiplayer, but we'll just have to wait and see. So now that you've heard me talk about all the stuff I really enjoyed about the game, let's move to things I had mixed feelings about, starting with the main hub. Now I like Skyrest, it does what it needs to do, but my main issue here lies with the NPCs. Personally, I didn't really resonate with any of them. Not that they were particularly bad, and they all had their roles to play, which they did fine, but none of them went above and beyond as characters. Even the really likable ones like Molhu, but he was probably my favorite. And this could just be a personal skill issue because I missed like 90% of the NPC quest lines, so if there's more to their story, it's very hard to find, because I scoured this game. So I highly recommend doing everything you can to progress the NPC quest lines, but I'll touch on that more in a little bit. My next mixed feelings lie with the levels, and let me preface this with a few things. The actual layout and design of every level is fantastic. Picking apart the world and exploring was always a blast, and they did a good job at making it worth your while, since there are secrets around every corner. My issue lies with the enemies. The enemy density in the levels is so high that you almost never have time to breathe. You're constantly under attack from all angles, and they hit hard, and this is true throughout the entire game. It's so easy to get overwhelmed that even if you take your time picking apart the enemies one by one, you're bound to miss a few and get ambushed. On top of that, you will have arrows and firebombs coming at you at all times. And I'm not entirely sure why the developers thought firebomb enemies needed to be in almost every level, but man, it felt like half the game was spent just dodging firebombs. But it's not the end of the world. Like I said, the actual levels themselves were amazing. It's also really easy to miss the blacksmith and go the whole game without being able to upgrade your weapons. So PSA to all you new players, before you get to the third boss, make sure you free the blacksmith. Just listen for the sound of a hammer. I also had mixed feelings about performance. The vast majority of the time, the performance was fine. I had a few frame dips whenever loading into new areas or switching into Umbral, but never at times that would cost me my life. Now, the developers did release a patch today that should make the performance all around a lot better, so you should be getting at least 60 frames at all times. However, there's one area that is still suffering in the late game that I'm not going to spoil, and the performance is really bad there. It's not unplayable by any means, but you may find yourself dropping into the 20s or 30s. However, it is consolidated to that one area, and they are aware of it and are actively working to fix it. So now let's get to the bad. One of the things things I was excited to experience in this game is PvP. I love PvP in Souls games and was excited to try it out after I got my character leveled up a little bit. And funnily enough, my very first invasion was against Sekiro Doobie, who a lot of you guys will recognize. Now, whenever I invaded him, I realized that we had a big difference in our level. My character was about halfway through the game and he was just now starting the second level. I didn't have any lag while fighting him, but there was no poise, and while using a strength build that became pretty annoying pretty quick. But I was still able to take him down and ruin his day. So my first invasion was a pretty good experience. But I played PvP for about an hour after that and only managed to connect about half the worlds that I matchmade with. And the more I played, the worse the connection got. With my character teleporting across rooms, very strange hit detection, and constant disconnects, PvP was just not a good experience. But like the frame rate we talked about, today's patch supposedly fixed a lot of the problems, but I haven't had the opportunity to test it out yet. I really hope they do a lot of work to PvP and make it a better experience, because all multiplayer activities reward you with items that can be exchanged for armor shaders and eventually exclusive armor sets that are actually extremely cool. And I really want that armor, but as it stands right now, I don't know if I'll have the patience to grind for it. But I've shared enough of my concerns so far. Let me go back to telling you some things that are awesome. 2 points that I think Lords of the Fallen does that every Souls-like going forward should replicate. Number 1 is a photo mode. Lords of the Fallen has a really good photo mode, and since games are getting way too beautiful nowadays, namely Elden Ring, this really should be a staple. The game also has armor tinks, which can be used to shade the armor you're wearing and color it in different ways. You can find these as loot throughout the world, or they can be gained through the multiplayer currencies, but it just adds that extra layer of fashion that I love, and I wish all Souls-likes did this. I also really liked the Umbral Remembrances, which were little lore moments you could find throughout the world in Umbral that create a scene of the past and allow you to listen in on the conversation that was taking place. And these are really important in understanding the story, and they also reward you with the currency used to purchase boss weapons. So you'll want to make sure and do every one of these that you come across. And finally, I want to highlight the build crafting. The amount of freedom the player has to create their character is huge, and you can optimize it in any way you want, even more so than a lot of other Souls-likes out there. And I'm not going to spoil a lot of the really cool parts of it, but just trust me when I say, if there's a particular build that you had in your head from all the promotional art or trailers or lore, chances are you can make that exact build. So I'll look forward to seeing what everybody comes up with. So to wrap up all my thoughts on Lords of the Fallen, I'll be giving the game an 8.5 out of 10. I had an absolute blast with it and was addicted the whole way through. It really was like stepping back into a new Dark Souls game, but also with the shortcomings of back then. The only things holding it back for me were a story that could have been explored a lot further and some questionable choices when it comes to the enemies. But if you are a fan of the Souls games, then Lords of the Fallen is an absolute must play and one that I really can't recommend enough. These are my honest thoughts about the game as a longtime Souls veteran, and I'll be really curious to see what all y'all are saying after you've had time to play through it for yourself. If you have any questions about the game, I'll try to answer as many as I can down in the comment section below. But if you enjoyed today's review, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here. I'll have all kinds of Lords of the Fallen content coming out very soon. So with all that, I will catch you in the next one.